Autism is a grouping of behaviours, and those behaviours affect reciprocal social interaction and social communication, combined with restricted interests and repetitive behaviours and sensory sensitivities, often with stereotyped motor mannerisms. So it's a behavioural diagnosis, those are the behaviours.
Autism is an umbrella term now, and it includes children who would be considered to have a severe autism, which might be called core autism, and then a much broader spectrum, which if you like comes out from that centre, which would be called an autism spectrum disorder, or now also sometimes called autism spectrum conditions. And those are varying in their degree of severity and also the profile of strengths and difficulties that an individual might have. And that would probably blur into the typical population, and then at that end might be considered to be more around, say, personality. So personality types who are highly exuberant social people, and others who are a bit more retiring and whose social life is not the most important thing for them.
Well, a diagnosis is really an agreed way of describing a certain set of problems that young people have that seem to hang together. So if you have some of those problems, you're likely to have most of them. And a diagnosis is a way of summarising the fact that you have that set of difficulties.
In some medical conditions, one can do a blood test or one can do an X-ray and you can see that condition. In something like an autism spectrum disorder, there is no such process. So what we have to do is look at the individual strengths and difficulties and see if that profile meets the criteria for a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder.
Diagnosis is important because it tells us a little bit about what the cause of your problem might be, and it also gives us some pointers as to what the most effective treatments might be. And furthermore, it tells us, perhaps rather less, but something about what the long-term outcome might be for you after you've received that treatment.
I think the suspicion that a child might have a developmental problem is very often comes from the parent first. Now that's not inevitable, and that partly depends upon the experience that parents have. So if they've had several children, then they will, or a large experience of children, then they will be able to notice particular problems at a much earlier stage. If it's their first child, they may not notice a problem until the child goes to a different social environment, for example, school.
That's the time when a lot of children are identified as having a social difficulty. And the way it manifests itself, the way it appears, is the thing that really will direct which professionals will start working with you. So if you have a child who is isolated in the playground, teachers will notice that. They will start thinking about what they can do about this, and they might be thinking, is there something happening at home? Is there some concern for the child? Ideally, they should always talk to parents about this, and then parents themselves might be thinking that they had noticed that the child was not enjoying a wedding recently or some social events. They may always have known that their child is actually not very happy in that kind of situation, but it's becoming more apparent to everybody else.
The next stage after a suspicion has been raised varies across the country, but ideally every locality would have a pathway for following from suspicion to referral to an appropriate group who were able to undertake a diagnosis.
In this country we have 3 tiers of health. We have what's called primary health, which would be GPs and health visitors and such like. We have secondary, which would be your local district team, so your speech therapy team, paediatric team, local district hospitals. And then we have a tertiary team, which would be a regional or national centre. And most children are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder by their local district team. not by the primary team. So they have to go through a process of getting referred from the primary to the district team and seeing that team and then have a diagnosis from them. And the process, people have been working very, very hard to speed that up, but the process will take several months.
Diagnosis for an autism spectrum disorder is done by taking a history and asking the parent about how a child behaves, giving examples of particular types of behaviour, focusing on the areas that would be a concern in autism, which would be reciprocal social interaction and communication, combined with restricted interests and repetitive behaviours and sensory sensitivities. So the questioning would be about those behaviours in different contexts.
But we need more information than that, because parents aren't always completely, the word we use is objective, but don't necessarily see their children in the same way that other people do. So we need to get a more rounded picture, and the way we do that is to get another set of information from somebody else who knows you well, probably a teacher, or in a preschool period from, say, a nursery nurse.
Also very important is to observe the child and to look for areas of difficulty, again within those areas which comprise the autism spectrum disorders.
There were some guidelines written quite a few years ago, and they suggested the diagnosis should be made by a team. And the reason for that is because it's not just knowing, yes, this is the label. The most helpful information is, what are my strengths, what are my difficulties, and those can only be measured by a range of professionals. So for instance, your intellectual, your thinking skills, your language skills, your motor problems, your physical skills, and then all of those things together give an individual a profile, which means we're better able to say how well we think you're going to do in school and what things we need to watch out for to help you with as you grow up.
For many people, the point of having a diagnosis is that it leads to understanding. So what parents comment on is that they now understand why their child behaves in a particular way. It can also lead to important interventions. So for example, in school, if a child is having particular difficulties in certain environments, particular difficulties with certain friendships, it can help to understand how you can support that child in managing better in that environment, or modify the environment in order to accommodate the child. For the older person, those young people that I've been in contact with say that it helps to understand themselves, and that in itself is valuable.
It is not a degenerative disorder. It doesn't usually get worse. Children will learn skills and they will improve. The degree to which they improve depends on each individual and their own strengths and difficulties. But children who have developed language and don't have severe learning difficulties often can do extremely well. And then it's a matter of managing the difficulty while concentrating on the strengths. There are a few factors that are important, such as personality, a child's resilience and how hard they can work on their difficulties, and also things like anxiety. But those are true for all adolescents. So there are all adolescents who may go through life and have a phase in their middle adolescence when they get very anxious, and that will affect their progress. So those factors are not unique to autism. And like any child, it's a matter of working towards the strengths, trying not to focus too much on the difficulty. And it's not possible to give a prognosis for people right across that whole spectrum, because it really is unique to each individual and their strengths and difficulties.